So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this presentation on how your diet affects the planet with Dr. Benjamin Halpern. He's the director of the UC Santa Barbara National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. He's also a professor of marine ecology and environmental planning at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management. And Michael Dimmock, Executive Director of Roots of Change, will moderate this presentation. And as you were just notified, this call is being recorded and we will share it in our Roots of Change newsletter and on our social media. So after a 30-minute presentation by Dr. Halpern, we'll start the Q&A session and we'll end the call at 1 p.m. We ask that you please keep yourself muted during the presentation, but you're welcome to put your questions in the chat box and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can during the Q&A session. During that session, if you could also please remember to mute yourself again after speaking, we'd appreciate that. And so with that, I'm handing it over to Michael Dimmock, Executive Director of Roots of Change.
Hello, everyone. We're really glad you could join us today. I just want to share a few words about why Roots of Change is hosting this event. We all know that climate change, species extinction, and degradation of essential resources like water and soil have become existential threats to life and civilization as we know it. And that the food system, the provisioning of food through the system the way it's designed today, is one of the major sources of those degradations. So we're always interested in research projects, programs that help us identify the nature of those impacts and the places where we can intervene to mitigate those impacts, but also track change over time. I saw the coverage of this paper in the major, it was either New York Times or Washington Post about 6 weeks ago. I reached out to Dr. Halpern, Ben, as I'll call him with his permission, soon after that, and he agreed that it would be interesting to have a conversation with a larger group about the findings. And this is particularly of interest to us because on these large reviews of the system and the impact, sometimes nuance is lost. And we're really interested in the nuance around different types of production systems and their differences in their relative impacts on the environment, human health. And so I have some questions about that I'll bring up at the end. But before I do that, I just want to thank Ben for his good work at the center, this particular compelling paper, and for him taking time to meet with us all today. So with that, I'll hand it to you, Ben.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael and Doris, for the introductions and everyone for joining. Excited to have the opportunity to share this and, of course, to get your feedback and questions and ideas and think about how we together can try to make a difference in our food systems. So as Michael said, this work came out about 6 weeks ago, so it's still pretty new off the presses. And we have some follow-on work we're continuing, so I'll share insights into a little bit of that, but excited to give you a little bit deeper dive into the work and then take your questions. So, oops, sorry. I'm going to start with kind of the story of my journey to this research, actually. About 5 or 6 years ago, I became a pescatarian based on the news of the environmental footprint or consequences of food production. But I'm a scientist, right? And I thought, well, maybe I should check the evidence for this, not just read the news stories. And as I dug deeper into the research, there were things that became apparent, but also clear gaps in the work that I felt were necessary to try to make better decisions. And so that motivated what became a nearly 5-year project to pull together all of the information needed to answer these kinds of questions. And I'll tell you at the end where my diet has ended up. But this question of, which I know motivates so many people, what should I eat to be healthy to myself, to be healthy to the environment, to be healthy to the animals that we are farming? These kinds of questions were what motivating this research. Now, I'm guessing many of you know some of the bigger context of the environmental footprint or consequence of food that makes it into the news quite a bit. You may not know the details of it, but you know the kind of the bigger picture. You know, agriculture worldwide uses 70% of all fresh water. You know, that's a lot, right? You know, that's a huge amount of our global freshwater resources that's put towards agriculture. It makes sense. It's helping us grow food, but there's lots of other things we need water for. And if there's ways to reduce that need, that will be of benefit to the planet and biodiversity and all the other uses for water. It's also a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. The exact numbers vary depending on the accounting system. I've seen everything from 21 to this number, 34%. So we can maybe say it's about a quarter of all emissions are coming from food production. So this is, you know, on par with transportation. It's one of the major contributors to climate change. And anything we can do to reduce those emissions will have a global benefit. We also use a lot of land and ocean for our food. Nearly 40% of all land, habitable, arable land on the planet is used for crops and pasture. So, you know, nearly half of our planet we've converted to food production, which is a lot. So if we can do that more efficiently, that leaves more space for people and more space for biodiversity and less impact on our planet. One of the key things that actually drives a lot of the environmental consequences of food production is this aspect of feed. So anything that needs to be fed has both the consequences of the animal itself and the consequences of the feed used to feed that animal. And so these conversion ratios are a really important part about understanding the environmental consequences of livestock. So whether that's terrestrial livestock, chickens, pigs, and cows, sheep, goats, things like that, or fish, farm fish that get fed. And so you can see there's a huge difference in these conversion ratios that translate into the reasons why certain things, especially cow, tend to have a larger environmental consequence. It just takes a lot more feed to grow a pound of beef than it does to grow a pound of fish. So there, up until a study we've done, there were only a few studies that have really tried to look across a bunch of different foods to understand the environmental consequences. And most of them have focused on greenhouse gas emissions, which is important. Like I said, it's a major part of the environmental consequence of food production, but it's just one of the things that makes a difference. So this is a study from about a decade ago that looked at several crops, livestock on land, livestock products, milk and eggs, butter, and then a few fish. And this is the kind of ranking that a lot of news media and people use to kind of think about what foods we should eat. So you can see from an emissions perspective, you know, some of the aquaculture, that closed system aquaculture and trawl fisheries are actually, you know, higher than chicken and pork, and, you know, about half of what we see from cows. And, you know, you can see that many crops have much, much lower emissions consequences. So these are the kinds of studies that really motivated me thinking about the work we did and the kinds of decisions we as individuals and as consumers and policymakers need to be informed by to make smart food policy and food consumption decisions. A couple of years ago, this study came out. This is a mess of information to look at, and I don't expect you to digest it all quickly, but this is one of the very few studies that really tried to look comprehensively across multiple different types of stressors associated with food production. So you have greenhouse gas emissions, land use, acidification, eutrophication, which is nutrient pollution, and scarcity of water or water use. So they looked at 5 different measures across a lot of different foods and kind of rank ordered them comparison in the per pound or per kilogram consequence of each type of food. What's interesting from here is you can see there's only 2 types of fish included in this, and they're lumped, all crustaceans that are farmed and all fish that are farmed. But there are literally thousands of species of fish that are caught by wild-caught fisheries and hundreds that are farmed in aquaculture that are basically lumped and or forgotten in these kinds of analysis. And aquaculture represents half of all seafood we eat globally. Fisheries and aquaculture together are a major source of food and protein for people around the world. So to leave out all that seafood from these food comparisons seemed like a major glaring gap in what we need to know for our broader food systems and food system sustainability assessments. So that context set the stage for what we're trying to do in this study. And there are three things that we really felt were missing from this literature. First of all, as I've already suggested or pointed out, the work is really siloed. It's either looking at a single stressor or certain groups of food, but not all foods. So to really inform the kinds of decisions we want to make about food, we need to be thinking about all food. And we need to be doing it in a way that allows us to compare across these different multiple stressors that are all associated with food production, but are rarely combined together to look at that total environmental footprint of any given food production. So we want to break down those silos and really look at things more comprehensively in a way that can be compared across foods, across stressors together. The second thing that we wanted to do is move beyond the per unit measure, per pound or per kilogram assessment, which is of course important because that's sort of how you can measure your individual consumption consequence. Because of course, we or our families might eat a pound of meat in a meal. We're not going to eat a ton of meat, right? But the consequence of food production on our planet is a combination of those per unit measures. What is the environmental consequence of a pound of food, but also the volume of production. So you can have something that's horribly inefficient, but we only produce 10 pounds of it, and it's just not having a planetary consequence. Or you can have something that's of medium environmental consequence, but we're producing a huge amount of it, and that volume means that we're having a large impact on the planet. So we wanted to account for that volume as well as the per unit measure. And then finally, we wanted to map it, because we know that different foods have different consequences in different places, both because of the production methods that are done by an individual farmer or a food sector in a particular place, but also the potential environmental sensitivities in those places or the people that live there. And so without these maps of where food is having an environmental footprint, we don't really have a key piece of information needed to make smart decisions about where and how much food production of different types of food to do in any given place. So the work we've done addresses all of these things, and you'll see them in the results that I share. So I want to show you the outcome of all of this work where we mapped the global footprint of food production. Now I want to share this as a schematic of what we did in this work. So we have 4 broad groups of food: livestock, terrestrial livestock, aquaculture, crops, and fisheries. And for each of these food groups, we have individual food items, which I'll show you more later, each with associated pressures from greenhouse gas, GHG emissions, disturbance of land or ocean, nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, or water use. And those colored squares show you which types of activities associated with food production have connected pressures associated with them. And then we can calculate the cumulative or sum of those 4 pressures that allow you to look at all sorts of measures of environmental footprint. And both of these things, the individual pressures and the cumulative pressure, we can map, and we can do that for any given food or any given pressure, any groups of foods. So there's a lot of flexibility in the kinds of results that we can present. And with this, we were able to account for 99% of all reported global food production across these 4 broad categories. And as I mentioned, we account for both the efficiencies, the per pound or per kilogram pressures associated with food production, and the volume that's happening in any given place. Okay, so I want to share 4 main take-home results that come from this work. There's lots of nuance and detail, but these are the 4 big picture take-homes I hope you take away from this. So first, the environmental footprint of food production is highly concentrated. So this is a map of these cumulative pressures across all food. Those red spots are the top 1% of all environmental footprint of food production. So this is on land and in the ocean. So the entire planet, land and sea, those are the top 1%. And they're almost entirely on land because that's where the vast majority of food production exists. But they're really, really concentrated. So we have the top 1%, those red spots, produce about 40% of the total cumulative pressure of food production. So nearly half of all pressure from food production comes from just 1% of the planet. And in fact, the top 10% of areas produce 93% of the total pressure. So almost the entire environmental cumulative pressure from food production comes from just 10% of the planet. So it's really, really concentrated. And in fact, the top 5 countries account for 50% of that food pressure. So India, China, United States, Brazil, and Pakistan are 50% of that total production, or pressure, sorry, or nearly 50%. And these countries here that are about, I think 20 countries are more than 70%. So it's many ways of telling the story that it's highly, highly concentrated. So that means there's challenges with that. It's having a really big impact on those places, but there's some advantages that having it concentrated, maybe you can release pressure from other areas and keep it concentrated. There's an interesting policy dialogue around what to do about that. This is, I'll just quickly talk about these squares, triangles, and circles. So we looked at the environmental pressure of food, both in tons, weight, but also protein and calories, because these are different ways that we think about the benefit of food for people. And the efficiency, the amount of pressure, which is the colored bars, relative to the amount of food produced in tons, protein, or calories, gives you a sense of whether or not a country is able to meet its environmental targets and productivity efficiently or less efficiently. And so for countries where those symbols are inside the bar, they're having more environmental pressure relative to the production in tons, protein, or calories of food, like in India. Whereas if those symbols are outside the bar, like in China, they're producing a lot more in terms of tons, protein, and calories than their total environmental pressure. So China is much more efficient than India in this case, because they're able to produce a lot more food with less pressure. So it's one way we can think about the spatial differences in countries and how efficient or inefficient they are in producing that food. And I'll show you some more results related to that in a minute. There's other ways we can slice and dice this. This is the same countries, instead of the pressures associated with those 4 categories, disturbance, greenhouse gas, nutrient pollution, and water use, we're looking at it by food sector. So India and China have a huge amount of crops for human consumption. That's not surprising. You can see the proportion of their total environmental footprint that comes from those foods versus ruminant meats, chicken meat, and so on. And you can see certain countries like China, Indonesia, and Russia have much larger blue bars. That's from marine fisheries than other countries where aquatic foods are a much, much smaller percentage of their total environmental footprint. So this is also a way of starting to account for the relative contribution of land versus ocean-based food for driving the environmental consequences of food production for those countries. We can see these spatial patterns and high concentration in the individual stressors, pressures as well. So this is that land and sea disturbance. It's really concentrated in places like India, China, US, Brazil, Europe. More extensive but similar patterns for nutrient pollution from phosphorus and nitrogen. Water use, different patterns, although India and China light up as well. And then greenhouse gas emissions are a lot more extensive. A lot of different foods from a lot of different places are having a pressure associated from greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, that's the first one, highly concentrated. The second is a shorter message, but an important one, and you kind of got hints at this, is that these food systems are connected in ways that I don't think people often pay attention to. So I'm just going to tell this through one story, looking at chicken and farmed salmon. these colorful maps are showing the intensity of the cumulative environmental footprint from these production systems. And you might immediately see, wait, chicken has a marine ocean footprint? And indeed it does, because we feed forage fish, the small sardines and anchovies, to chicken, actually to pig as well. It's a major part of their diet. And so we actually have this terrestrial livestock having an ocean footprint in its production. And the reverse is true for farmed salmon. We actually feed many crops, soy and other crops, to salmon in their feed, increasingly so. And so salmon have a terrestrial footprint. And so when you start to pay attention to this mapped distribution of the environmental pressures associated with food production, you see these connections across food systems, but also across our planet. And so thinking about how to fix some of these problems or address some of these problems, there's a lot of space for innovation in feed components that can really help mitigate some of these pressures. And we can talk more about that later. Okay, the third message is that we're getting some differences in the rank order of food with this new lens that's focused on multiple pressures at one time, the cumulative pressure, and accounting for the volume, not just the per pound or per kilogram ranking of things. So here are the livestock. You might immediately notice that pig meat is higher than cow meat. And this is something that is not commonly told in the news media because, for example, cows have very high greenhouse gas emissions, which is that pink bar in the cow's meat. And indeed, they are #1 for climate emissions. But pig meat production is so vast across the planet and has a huge nutrient pollution problem, those brown bars in there, that it ends up topping cow meat as the #1 pressure on our planet. We can look at other foods. So here are marine and freshwater fisheries, as well as mariculture, the farming of seafood. And the bars jigger like that. So the lines that drop down help connect similar values across the plots, because otherwise you couldn't see the small differences in mariculture. It's a much smaller scale. But demersal fish, these are the trawl fisheries where you drag those big nets across the bottom to catch fish like flounder and halibut. They have a huge disturbance of the seafloor, that's the brown bar, and also very large greenhouse gas emissions because it takes a ton of fuel to drag those giant nets across the ocean. So they end up exceeding many of the other livestock because of the cumulative pressure of those two things. And then crops are much smaller, but you can see on many of them anyway, you can see things like rice and wheat. They have huge volume production, take a lot of water, and have quite a bit of greenhouse gas emissions associated with them. So when you put it all together, which you see on the left there, these are the take-home rank order things to kind of pay attention to. So the top 5, if you want to think of it that way, are pig, cow, rice, wheat, and milk, right? And most people don't pay attention to rice and wheat in these rankings, but there's so much production of them, volume, that collectively that has a big consequence for the planet. So policy that can address better efficiency in the production of those commodities, those crops, can have a huge benefit to our planet. Certain foods just don't have some pressures associated with them. So fisheries don't take any water. They also don't produce any nutrient pollution because they're not farmed. We're harvesting them from the wild. So that inherently makes fisheries likely to be better because they have fewer pressures associated with them. And we can see that in that third set of bars down there, the marine and freshwater fisheries. Demersal fishery is pretty high, but the others are mostly pretty low, and they only have brown and pink bars. They don't have the blue and dark brown ones because those two pressures aren't associated with fisheries. So there's some food groups that just inherently can be better, especially if done well. Circling back to that feed discussion, crops and quite a lot of aquaculture like mussels, oysters, clams, seaweed are not fed. And anything that's not fed is inherently going to have a better chance of being more environmentally efficient because you don't have that additive effect of feed plus the animal being fed, creating an environmental pressure. So there's groups of foods that are just naturally going to be better. And then the take home I hope you get from this is that looking at multiple pressures, these cumulative pressures, really tells a different story. And this is really why one of the main motivations for this work is to move beyond those individual pressure stories and think about them all together, because that is the real consequence of food production, but we don't often pay attention to it that way. And then the last message from this work is that there are highly variable efficiencies in food production by country. So we assessed each food in each country for each of the pressures. So we have country specific and mapped values of the food production amount in pounds or tons, protein or calories, and the 4 pressures and the cumulative pressure associated with them. And that variation among countries really helps think about where strategies for better food policy and food consumption exists. We can think about targeting highly efficient countries for more production, or those that are really inefficient for mitigating those pressures there, or changing trade policy to address them. And so we can look at these efficiencies, and a couple things emerge from that. So each dot is a country here, and I've color coded 6 of them just to anchor your view on what's going on across them. There's about 200 countries that we track. Each dot is a different country. You can see they're scattered all over the place, which means there's high variation. Those boxes tell you the kind of the 25th to 75th percentile values, and the dark black line is the average, the mean value. So you get a lot of variation. The rank order in efficiencies based on efficiencies change. So goat and sheep meat are the least efficient across most countries. So now they're less efficient than cattle and pig. And again, like I said before, the rank order of foods is different when you think about cumulative pressures. So here you can see each of those dots. Again, as a country, you can take a food. Let's take sheep meat. And you can see that Brazil, or actually the United States, is on the lower end. So it's more efficient compared to India, which is higher up, which is less efficient. You can get almost a 2 to 3 times difference in the efficiency of sheep meat between these 2 countries. And you can make those kinds of comparisons for every kind of food. We can look at that for all the marine and freshwater fisheries and the mariculture. Again, that red bar just shows you the similar values across the cascading plots. And again, you see a lot of variation among countries and among foods. And the rank order of these things really change compared to the previous plot, which was rank ordered against purely the volume of production times these efficiencies. And then there are crops. And we can circle back to these if you want to dig into details of these. The take home really is that there's a lot of variation. So crops and aquaculture are generally efficient, which we kind of knew in a lot of ways, but this is confirming that in this multiple pressure lens of things. There's a lot of variation among countries. It can be 2.5 to 8.5 times for crops. So you can see the dots scattered across. So the worst dots are 2 to 8 times worse than the better dots in any given food group. For fisheries, it's a huge variation. It's 22 times or more for countries and their efficiency in producing fisheries. Quickly can note the question about efficiency. It's the amount of pressure associated with any given pound or kilogram of food production. So if you have 1 pound of food producing a ton of nutrient pollution versus 2 pounds of food for a ton of nutrient pollution, the more food for the same amount of pressure or the same amount of food with less pressure makes it more efficient. That's what we mean by efficiency. And here's just one example, soy production. If you compare the United States to India, so the United States is nearly 3 times more efficient than India in its soy production. And a lot of this comes from 2 things. One is access to technology, so the seed for soy and more efficient application of fertilizer, and also policy that regulates those aspects of the food sector make soy production more efficient or less environmental pressures associated with that food production than we see in India. And you can tell these kinds of stories for all sorts of combinations and comparisons within our food system. Another example that you get within countries, so you can think about how you might shift food production within a country rather than among countries. So in Indonesia, for example, pigs are nearly 7 times less efficient than cows in terms of their total pressure across all those 4 categories of pressure. And so here's a case that in this particular country, if you wanted to substitute meats, you could have a lower environmental pressure from cow production than pig production, all else staying equal. And so there's strategies to think about within and among country policy that can help mitigate environmental pressures. So these differences, as I've already said, create really interesting policy and trade opportunities to think about where and how to incentivize different food production. So I want to end this part of the story, and then I'll end the talk with just 2 last points, with really emphasizing what does that leave us as individuals to do about all this. And I'd say I hope you take home 2 kind of calls to action. One is choice, individual choice. And I would say, anyone that can eat a little less meat, doesn't have to mean cutting it out of your diet, but a little less meat goes a long way. And eating more shellfish, they're really, really good for your diet. They're actually good for the planet. They have very low environmental pressures associated with them. And in fact, there's some positive aspects to them. They can help filter water, remove pollution, and they actually create habitat. So there's some foods that have net benefits even. So these are choices that we can make as individuals that collectively, if they add up over thousands or millions of people, can really make a difference. So this is the individual choice. And then I say individual voice is really important because we need to engage in the local and regional policy to make a difference at scale, right? And that's how we really change food systems more quickly, is engaging with policy and getting that regional to national to international level change happening, informed by the data and science, to really incentivize food systems to be as sustainable as possible. And I just want to end with 2 slides about other things that I'm working on that are just teasers about what's coming down the road. If we want to talk more about it, we can, and then I'll end and open it up for questions. The first is to think about environmental justice implications of these maps of food production's footprint, right? So for the first time, we have these maps of where multiple pressures from food production are happening. And it really then begs the question, like, well, who is paying the price of those environmental pressures? So this is some really interesting work from Steve Wing from a few years ago, just in North Carolina, showing how industrial hog production, which has a lot of negative environmental and human health consequences from pollution, is concentrated through sort of redlining activities of people who were enslaved in the past and are kind of redlined into these districts, are really concentrated around these environmentally harmful food production systems. And we're starting to look at that at a global and national scale across all foods and environmental pressures associated with them. And another interesting thing that really ties into what I was saying before is looking at how we can improve food efficiencies through change in feed. So remember, feed is such a key aspect of what amplifies or multiplies the environmental pressures associated with food production. And especially in things like aquaculture, but we see this in livestock feed as well. There are really exciting innovations happening that can make a real big difference. So you may have read the news about how cows are starting to be fed seaweed, and it reduces their climate emissions significantly. Well, this is a really neat innovation in feed that can make a difference across an entire sector. And that's happening in aquaculture in a big way, where they're looking at alternative feed components that remove crops like soy, as well as reducing the need for forage fish from the oceans in their feed, which means you can have a case where you no longer are having Brazilian rainforests cut down to create soy crops that get fed to farmed fish, for example. So there's a lot of opportunity in this feed, and we're exploring ways of better understanding that and pushing for policy that enables these kinds of shifts. So that's a whirlwind tour of these results. I hope I've shared a few insights and maybe some food for thought to take with you. And I now really excited to open it up for questions and comments and discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ben. That was really well done. 30 minutes, getting that all down, 35 minutes. That was great. And so I'm going to try and pull together some of the things I'm seeing. I'm going to take a couple of minutes here, a bit of the time before we open it up for people to speak, because I want to just try and tie some of the things I've been seeing in the chat and some of the questions that I brought. And there are kind of three areas that I'm thinking about. One is the cultural implications of changes in food systems. For instance, large swaths of the planet are in fact only good for grazing land, and there are cultures that are grazers. That's how they live. They live on meat, and they convert what we couldn't eat or we couldn't grow crops into food that's needed, proteins. So I'm just going to ask you to reflect on this. Another thing I want you to think about is the differences in production systems. For instance, I'm sure that your aggregate data that you have to use at a scale, I mean, an impressive and compelling scale like you're using here to look at the whole planet, you've got to use basically aggregated data that particularly in the developed world, what we'd call the first world in terms of food systems and food industry, that is what we would call an industrial system. So for instance, in meats, you're completely dependent upon the corn and soy complex in the middle part of the country, where you can see all of that impact, all those different impacts, versus a grass-fed grazier out there who's producing a grass-fed meat that's ending up in a marketplace. There's a big difference potentially because, for instance, graziers have huge habitat advantages that Audubon and all these different conservation organizations are investing in. So I'm just interested in that nuance, that challenge. And the third thing is that we are in this moment of flux. The US government is just putting billions of dollars into what they call climate smart commodity partnerships, trying to innovate and get producers into a new world of food production. So I'm just interested in your responses, because this is what I opened with, nuance. How do we get to nuance so that we don't block the innovation, like kill all the meat producers whose systems are important in many ways?
Yeah, let me take a stab at that. And if I forget to touch on something, you can circle back and remind me. So to your first point, absolutely, there are really important cultural and dietary differences in what people need. So there's large parts of the world where people need to eat more meat and eat more food just to have a healthy diet. They're malnutritioned or undernourished. And to say eat less is like completely wrong in those places. And there are many cultural reasons, as you point out, that people have their food system in certain grazed animals or certain crops. All of that is super important. And actually our work tries to account for some of that. Like I said, we have national and subnational level accounting for which foods are grown where and how. And so the policy recommendations should be different for different places. And I think really, I guess the recommendation to eat less meat was probably particularly targeted in the US, where we tend to eat more than we need dietarily and for the planet. But there are places that we should increase meat production for those communities. And I guess you can also not change the amount that's being produced, but you can do it more efficiently. And so that's really an opportunity where you're not asking people to change their diet necessarily, but you're thinking about ways through technology, through policy, through cultural practices, through other mechanisms to shift the production to be more efficient, have less environmental pressure associated with it. So there's many pathways to improvement that don't require diet change or severe diet change for sure. So excellent point, and I definitely did not sufficiently address that in the comments I shared. In the production system, did you want to?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The feedlots versus grazers, if you take example of cattle, and that's deeply accounted for in our analysis. So we look at where livestock or cattle are grazed, and those have a much smaller environmental footprint, both in the nutrient pollution that comes from them, but also the disturbance of the land, because like you point out, there is some conservation value to that. So the pressures associated with that vary by the production system as best as we can account for it in the data that are provided. And for things like cattle, they're actually pretty good. When you get into other food groups, they get lumped together. So you can't disentangle some, like fruits and vegetables are often all lumped together. We know there's huge variation in the production of fruits and vegetables, but the data aren't reported at a sufficiently resolved detail. So as much as we can, we have accounted for that, but we know there's room for lots of improvement. If you wanted to do a focus study on California or the United States, you would want to like dig deeper into that information. So yeah, the idea actually is not to stifle innovation, but to incentivize it. I think there's a lot of room for innovation in policy, innovation in technology, innovation in awareness and education about the consequences of food production, to see how behavior and culture might shift. There's all sorts of food shifts that happen all over the place. Well, maybe we can try to incentivize those to go in different directions. So all of that, I think, hopefully creates space for innovation, not stifling it. This is trying to just provide some of the information needed to try to make it as good as possible.
Yeah, and I'll just say my final comment here before we open up that, you know, what I really like about this is the relative impacts of different foods, different systems. It seems to me that this is the beginning of a long journey to get to the kind of nuance that I'm talking about, where you can really pinpoint, like, I would be really interested in talking to you about an in-depth study of California or some other spots in the United States where people are trying to get into pasture silver systems and other silvopasture systems and grazier systems that have a different impact. And also what was really interesting to me is the lines in there that describe the difference between the Brazilian impact on meat production, the inefficiencies in Brazil versus the United States. A lot of meat is coming in from Brazil. It's cheap and it's highly impactful. And one thing we can take away is, if you're going to buy meat from a commodity system, buy it out of the United States, not out of Brazil, because you're having much higher negative impacts. With that, let's see. Let me just see if I have any. I don't see any more questions that I have missed. I don't believe you answered the one on efficiencies, and yeah. So, does anybody have a question out there? How are you going to do that, Doris? You going to unmute, or how are you going to do it?
People can unmute individually, and there's a few more questions in the chat box there. Are you able to see those?
I am. Yeah, I can run through it if you want.
Good, please. Yeah, because I'm having trouble seeing them for some reason.
Yeah, so Sarah McCammett wrote, plants are fed fertilizers that have a large environmental impact. Is that included in this? Absolutely. Yeah, fed, I'm talking about not fertilizer or something fed, but like a crop or another food that's being fed to an animal. But absolutely, with the nutrient pollution, fertilizer is the main source of that nutrient pollution for crops. So when you see nitrogen and phosphorus pollution in those figures, that's from fertilizer primarily in the crop case. We also, you know, for livestock, you have manure and other kinds of emissions like that, as well as fertilizer that goes into the feed, that goes into the livestock, being combined together to get the one of the 4 environmental pressures associated with it. So yes, absolutely, that's being included. Rose Patchen wrote, does the footprint get reduced in the animal waste if the animal waste is recycled? Like cow manure or fish emulsion are both great for soil and crops. And we did not have enough data to fully track that, but we do have some of that in there. So we know when manure is recycled into farm production, where that's happening and reported, we accounted for that. But it's imperfect. It's a really complicated system. And when you do things at global scales, you just can't get into that level of detail. And so, you know, a refined assessment that looked at California, or a particular place where you knew that kind of practice was widespread or making a difference, our framework would easily allow for incorporation of that, but we just don't have good detail for
Let me just say here, that's an important thing because, for instance, California is investing actually hundreds of millions of dollars in improving the composting systems to include animal waste in order to provide a resource rather than a waste product that we have a problem with.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is the place. There's lots of really cool things happening in the food system to try to make a difference. And you know, at the global scale, there's just not a lot of information on some of those kinds of examples. But Doris wrote, is soil degeneration factored in? No, we did a single snapshot in time. And so in the sense that any crop or livestock production disturbs the land and makes it less viable for biodiversity, both in the soil and above, is accounted for in a very general sense. But the long-term consequences of, or even short-term consequences of soil degeneration is a temporal aspect of the work, which we couldn't do. It was hard enough to do 1 year, let alone multiple years to start accounting for that. In the same way, we don't account for deforestation, right? So one of the huge problems we know in Brazil is deforestation of the Amazon, and the loss of incredibly biodiverse forest habitat is got many other consequences besides just converting that land, where there's a risk to lots of biodiversity, but that temporal change is not incorporated. So this is, a conservative estimate of these multiple pressures for sure. How about the concern about mercury in fish and other sea life? I love this question because it gives me a chance to fix a misunderstanding about the risk of mercury pollution. It is a problem. For sure. But one of the really great things about fish is it's high in selenium, and selenium counteracts mercury. It absorbs it and keeps it out of our human systems in most cases. And so even if there's mercury in the fish, it is safe to eat because the selenium is binding the mercury and it's not getting into your system. You absolutely do not want to inhale or ingest mercury. That's what happened to all those Mad Hatters. And it was really bad for all sorts of reasons, but it's not the risk that many people think about for seafood. There are other kinds of pollution that we know less about, like some of the toxic chemicals that there are literally tens of thousands of new chemicals a year produced, and we do not know much about them. So some of those unknown ones I'd be more worried about than mercury. Maria Giovanni wrote about whether religion has an influence in the environmental efficiencies. So in this case, pork in Indonesia, but there's cow in India, and absolutely. So if you are raising an animal but not slaughtering it, you're not getting the food out of it, but you're having almost as much or most of the environmental pressure, and so it makes it less efficient. So that's part of the story in Indonesia and in India for the inefficiencies of some of those foods. There's cultural reasons for that. So again, this doesn't mean they should change. There are good, strong religious or cultural reasons for different food preferences, but it's something to be aware of and think about what that means for how to make those systems more efficient if possible. Melinda Hemmelgarn, sorry if I mispronounced that, asked about shellfish and industrial shrimp farming. Thank you for this question because I am a little sloppy in my use of shellfish, or rather shrimp get lumped in with other shellfish too much in my opinion. So when I talk about shellfish, I'm talking about bivalves and things. So oysters, clams, mussels, things like that, filter feeders. Shrimp are a whole different beast, and I don't eat shrimp because of that. They have, as many of you know, they have a lot of habitat destruction for coastal habitats like mangroves. They have a lot of pollution associated with them, a lot of disease. They tend to not be great options, but of course people love shrimp. But there are some really great midwater trawl shrimp that have really low bycatch and really low, they're wild, they're not farmed. So if you love shrimp, there's some great options that are not farmed but are wild caught, especially in California and Oregon. In Oregon, there are these tiny pink shrimp that are great, and in Southern California, there's spot prawns, which are wild caught and are fantastic. Good for the environment, tasty to eat. So there's some advice on that. Jennifer Ford asked if we looked at GMO production. No, mainly because there's not enough data for us to access that. And then there's important cultural and personal beliefs around whether GMO is what you want to do. But the short answer is we weren't able to look at that. Maybe I'll pause, let any other questions, if there are any, jump in.
Ben, it's Jennifer again. Can I ask a follow-on to that question? Because it's my understanding that, for example, Russia's not using GMOs. So if we could revisit that slide that shows on a per country impact.
Yeah.
And while we're looking at that too, I had another question about per capita. If you look, you said India and China had some of the greatest proportion of environmental pressures. If we looked at that per capita, would we see the same thing since they have such giant populations?
Yes. Great point. The top 5 countries also have a lot of land space and a lot of people. So it's not surprising that they're on the top. But we look at production, not consumption. Some of the follow-on work that we're doing around environmental justice, we do start to track consumption because where people are that are eating the food is not often where it's grown or produced. And so you get huge potential for environmental injustices through those trade behaviors. But you're right, like, India and China produce a lot of food just for their own domestic consumption because there's over 1 billion people, 1.2 billion people in these countries. So it's not surprising that there's a lot of production there. But China is just a really fascinating story of trade. There's all sorts of things imported, exported, re-exported, and it gets really complicated to follow that path to understand where the food is going and who's kind of paying the consequence of that food production. But you're right. So we can look at it per capita, but we're more interested now, instead of doing that, to really try to follow the path of consumption to really understand what's going on.
This brings up the complexity of what you're doing. The actual, this is a long journey, it seems to me, because I just think about what's going on in California with water. So we're incredibly efficient at producing crops, but we're exporting like 85% of the world's almonds come from here. 2 million acres of almonds in the state, which is causing all kinds of, it's a monoculture, which has impacts in many different ways. So we, in effect, are exporting water to other parts of the world in a state which is water poor and is increasingly water poor. They're talking, this year, over 500,000 acres of irrigated land was taken out of production because of lack of water. My belief is that by the end of the century, we're going to have, instead of 9 million acres irrigated, we're going to have 4.5, 5 million acres irrigated because we just don't have the water. So the question is, when you talk about efficiencies and kind of trying to shift the production to those places that are most efficient, how do we factor in these issues around a global warming and the drier climates?
Yeah, such a good question. And that's like starting to get into forecasting where food production will go and what are the environmental constraints of that food production, like water availability, but also temperature, which influences the viability of many livestock production systems. And so I don't have results to speak to that. So this is conjecture based on just being in this space now, analytical space for a while. But I think that solutions for the future need to account for both the kind of technology, policy, cultural shifts that we can make now to improve efficiencies, to reduce the need for those resources of land or water or the emissions of things we don't like, climate change emissions or pollution. So there's different ways of gaining those efficiencies. But then we also need to ideally help food production systems move into new areas as climate changes, right? So we need to be climate smart and climate resilient in their food production systems. And that's hard, right? I mean, people are anchored to a place and their own legacy of understanding crop production or food production for their place, getting them to move their food production somewhere or to change the type of food they produce it's a big lift. And so we're going to need ways of supporting those kinds of changes to enable climate smart and environmental smart food production in the future.
Wow. That I think we're coming to the end here. So I think that was a really nice closing statement. I just want to say, here's what I took from this. The more that we can encourage farmers to work with nature, bring more nature onto the farm, integrate species back into the farms, the more we can mimic natural systems. Like the bison used to be so important. The grasslands depend on ruminants to be eating the grass down. The more we can get into that system and get less use of expensive, highly impactful inputs to a system, the better off we're going to be. And the deeper our research, the kind of research that you're doing to get to more and more nuance, the better off we're going to be. So I want to thank everyone for coming today, particularly you, Ben, for your good work. Appreciate it. Want to stay in communication with you, and hopefully work together on policy and support your research going further in ways that we can to get down. I'd really love to see this done in California, the regions of California, at the same level of specificity would be fascinating. The state could use that, and all the agriculture and advocates who care about the future could use that kind of data. So really appreciate you all showing up. And I think we're going to try and do something like this every quarter with a really great researcher sharing with us what they're learning. I think it'd be fascinating for the community that we serve. Thank you, Ben, and everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Great to have you. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
I'll be in touch, Ben.
Okay, sounds good.
Great job. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks
all.
for being here.